The format today is that we will have two sessions. The first session will focus on coastal proposed regulations, land subject to coastal storm flowage, and other proposals. We're going to try to get through an overview of these regulations for the first half hour, and then leave a half an hour for questions and answers. And then at around 2 o'clock, we'll do the same thing for the stormwater standards. We'll go the first half an hour roughly for stormwater, and then we'll leave the last half an hour for questions and answers. So while we're going through, we would prefer you to leave questions until the Q&A sessions, but you can put them in the chat and we will go through, both people who raise hands and people who put questions in the chats. So we'll look at both of those. With that, I'm going to, we'll start the session. And I would like to introduce a few people. First, my boss, Stephanie Mora, the Division Director of Wetlands and Waterways, will be helping me to manage this meeting and to manage the Q&A. And as presenters, along with me, is Jill Provençal from the MassDEP Northeast Regional Office, Wetlands Section Chief, and Pam Harvey, MassDEP, a longtime expert in many capacities, and we brought Pam back for this to help with these regulations. So let's move on to the next slide. So the agenda for this presentation on coastal regulations is that we'll start with a high-level introduction on the proposed regulations in land subject to coastal storm flowage. And then I'll turn it over to Jill to talk about how land subject to coastal storm flowage functions and learning from past storms. And then Pam will then go through the proposed standards in land subject to coastal storm flowage, and then she'll go through the additional proposed standards. And finally, we'll give you an overview of the schedule and how to comment formally, and then we will open up the floor to questions. So next slide.
Lisa, sorry, if I may just interject briefly. This may be obvious to many of you, but just in case, this session is a public information session where we'll be engaging with folks in questions and answers after each of the presentations. Please don't mistake this for submitting your formal comments on the proposed regulations. Lisa and the team will go over at the end of each presentation what the formal public comment period is and how those comments can be received. So just wanted to make sure that that distinction was clear to folks. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, so just to give you an overview of these standards, some of you may know, but MassDEP has been working on standards in land subject to coastal storm flowage for a number of years. Land subject to coastal storm flowage has been a resource area in the Wetlands Protection Act that's been protected since the very beginning, but we've never had standards. So it's very important that we do so. And the goal of these standards is to improve designs to reduce existing and increasing risk due to stronger coastal storms that we're seeing, sea level rise, and increasing precipitation. We expect that these standards will reduce storm and flood damage on development and infrastructure, that it will reduce risk to public health and safety, and that they'll protect, importantly, the natural function of the floodplain. Next slide. And, by spending the time that we have in evaluating, land subject to coastal storm flowage and the need and the importance, we come to realize that it's not just important for environmental reasons, it's also important for economic reasons. And I refer to an article that was published in 2022 by Commonwealth Magazine, where they reported on the big three credit rating agencies who had primarily good things to say about the Massachusetts economy, but one firm warned about the counterweight in the state's vulnerability to coastal storms and flooding. And specifically, the S&P 2022 rating indicated or stated that they considered Massachusetts environmental risks moderately negative in the credit rating analysis because of the Commonwealth's coastal exposure. And specifically in the combined Boston and Cape Cod areas, exposing the state to significant economic disruption following a high impact event. And so the implementation of these standards, are not, like I said, not only important for environmental reasons to protect the function of the floodplain, but also to keep Massachusetts economy strong. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jill Provençal to talk about LSCSF functions and what we've learned from past storms.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. So land subject to coastal storm flowage, or LSCSF, I have learned to say that 5 times fast. As we know, LSCSF is a coastal resource area that has the ability to diminish and buffer the high energy effects of storms by absorbing wave energy and flood water, reducing erosion, and dissipating storm flow energy. So LSCSF standards are based on the FEMA flood zones. And within LSCSF, we have the velocity zone, or V zone, also known as the coastal high hazard area. The V zone boundaries are determined by reference to the currently effective or preliminary firm map prepared by FEMA. Now, these areas are subject to high velocity wave action from storms and have a projective wave height of 3 foot or greater, or at least 3 feet of runoff. Then landward of the velocity zone is the MOA, or area of moderate wave action, also considered a high hazard area of the A zone. These areas experience waves with heights between 1.5 feet and 3 feet, storm surge, and wave runoff. Then landward of the MOA is the MEWA, or area of minimal wave action, also located within the A zone. This area is considered the lower hazard portion of the A zone and is subject to wave heights less than 1.5 feet during the 1% annual chance flood. Now, the boundary between the MOA, and the MEWA is called the LIMWA, or limit of moderate wave action. Now, please note the complete up-to-date LIMWA lines are only available through the FEMA Flood Map Service Center as part of the National Flood Hazard Layer. They are not shown on MassGIS or other state viewers. And then landward of the MEWA is the X zone, and this area is currently not located within the FEMA 1% chance floodplain. So most of the areas, or primarily the areas along the coast of Massachusetts, consist of protected reservations, coastal reservations, natural wetland resource areas, and rural to highly urbanized development. Each of these areas, regardless of its present landscape, are subject to erosion, scour, and damage from coastal storm events. So what have we learned from past storms? One source we look to is FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assessment Teams, or MATS, who conduct engineering analysis after major natural disasters to assess damage to government facilities, homes, businesses, and other structures, and determine the causes of structural failures and successes, with the goal of learning exactly what happened and why, and how to reduce disaster damage in the future. What we can take away from this particular analysis assists us in how we look at rebuilding efforts, new construction, building code policies, and regulations. So in certain areas, the map found that flow channelization tends to be highly localized, and changes in elevations can facilitate flow channelization. So in this figure, 310 from the Hurricane Sandy MAT report, they identified flow paths A, B, C, and D, and here are the paths coming in. Now, the flow channel A, go back up, this one here, resulted in washing this house into the bay. Then flow channels B, C, and D resulted in undermining foundations, here's C and B, and causing collapse of houses. Excuse me, that's the last slide. So the Hurricane Sandy map also found that buildings within 20 feet of erosion control structures exposed to ocean waves almost always sustain significant flood and or erosion damage. So other evaluations that we've looked to include, but are not limited to, the federal flood insurance claim maps, for which we can see on the landscape areas of repetitive damage from storm events. So for me, in closing, before I pass it on to Pam, observations, and again, I'm going to say including but not limited to those documented by FEMA and MassDEP and through our Mass Coastal Storm team, is really reshaping how we think about development and redevelopment within LSCSF. And we are hopeful that through these draft regulations, we can utilize what we have learned and adapt and change past practices within LSCSF and focus on utilizing this resource area and other wetland resource areas to our advantage by restoring and preserving its capacity to provide storm damage prevention and flood control. So Pam, take it away.
All right, thank you, Jill. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give you a brief tour of the draft regulations, beginning with this slide that provides some important orientation on how the regulations are put together, and this should help you as you read through them and think about them in more detail. So there are a couple of things that factors to consider if you're looking at a particular site. And first of all, is determining whether or not it is within another resource area or whether or not it's only within land subject to coastal storm flowage. So I'm going to give a little more detail on this in a minute, but if generally the rule is if it's within another resource area, you should follow those performance standards. And if it's only within land subject to coastal storm flowage, then you'd use these new provisions. But again, there are important exceptions, which I'll get to. The second thing is as Jill explained, is to determine what zone you're in within land subject to coastal storm flowage and using the FEMA map boundaries for those. And then whether or not the site that you're looking at has been developed previously or it's an undisturbed site and would be subject to new development. We have different provisions that apply in each of those cases. And then moving on to more general questions about the site, that we have some new limited projects for roads and water dependent uses, that those will apply to work in any coastal resource area. And then also applying to any coastal resource area, we have some provisions about nature-based shoreline protection, and I'll get more on those in a minute. Next slide. Okay, so there's an important section that you'll find it at 310 CMR 10.364 that explains when you're looking only at land subject to coastal storm flowage regulations or where it's a circumstance where it overlaps another resource area. And so basically, if it's only land subject to coastal storm flowage, you would use these provisions. The exception is that there's a provision which does not allow new structures in the velocity zone. And that applies in the other resource areas as well. And then also there's a elevation requirement for buildings in the moderate wave action zone, building code, barrier beach, whichever is higher. So those are important provisions. And then there are some circumstances where an applicant would have to meet both landscape coastal storm flowage and another regulatory requirement. There's a specific provision, coastal bank, where it doesn't supply sediment. You can take a look at that. And then also rocky intertidal shores. And then finally, the landscape coastal storm flowage regulations don't apply to marine industrial uses in designated port areas. Okay, next slide. Jill, next slide. Oh, here we go. Okay, so generally the landscape coastal storm flowage provisions are set up in a manner that's very consistent with the other coastal resource areas and for inland as well. So beginning with the preamble, Jill went over most of this about the functions of landscape coastal storm flowage and Lisa as well. And then the significance to flood control and storm damage prevention. There's some new definitions that apply for landscape coastal storm flowage, which you will want to look at the definitions section at the beginning of the regs that apply generally. And then also there's some definitions specifically to the coastal resource areas, which you'll need to refer to as well. As to the boundaries as shown of the various zones and the outer limits of landscape coastal storm flowage are presumed to be accurate based on the flood insurance rate maps. You can get a letter of map revision from FEMA that would be allowed under the regulations, and there is a provision to rebut that whether or not the outer limit should be more landward, and historical information can be taken into account as is the case now. And then finally, I just want to mention minor activities. This provision is in the minor activities section early on in the regs at 10.02. And there is a limited list in the minimal wave action area only, where certain fairly minor activities can go on without any review. So have a look at those. See if you have comments, welcome on that, as well as any other aspect of the regulations. Next slide. Okay, so here I'm going to be talking about new development. This is not redevelopment, but new development. The performance standards are set up by zone. Basically, for both the velocity zone and the moderate wave action zone, we have the same basic standard as the no adverse effects standard. For both of these zones, there are some activities that will be allowed, can be allowed, and they include walkways and boating facilities. Coastal engineering structure repair. And those apply to both these zones. An important distinction is that in the velocity zone, there are no new buildings, even on piles. For the moderate wave action zone, buildings can be allowed, provided they're up on piles, unobstructed flow beneath. They have to be elevated to base flood elevation. And there's quite a narrow provision that would allow some variance from the 2 feet. But for the most part, those are the standards that would apply for building elevation. There's some additional provisions about buildings in the moderate wave action zone that would tend to preserve existing vegetation, try to keep alterations to a minimum. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're moving on to the minimal wave action zone. That's again the lesser wave action out to the extent of landscape coastal storm flowage. Here, buildings can either be elevated on piles or on a solid foundation above base flood elevation. And there are some additional provisions here. The standard is minimizing adverse impact. And there are additional provisions about avoiding fill or structures that would redirect flow to other properties. And also there's a provision about being sure that there's not any routing of flow into where there's a topographic depression that would then the water would get trapped there and it would restrict return flow, stormwater management, and then trying to keep the site as permeable as possible. Those are also included for the minimal wave action area. Next slide. Okay, moving on to redevelopment. These provisions apply in areas where there's pavement and structures and already on the site, and there's a proposal to expand or rehabilitate or replace buildings. And there are provisions that here the basic standard is to improve existing conditions. They're fairly similar to the redevelopment provisions for the riverfront area. And certainly, quite a bit of land subject to coastal storm flowage is already developed. So, and there are different provisions that apply depending on which zone it's in. So there are tighter standards for low velocity zone, and then the areas further back. It's important to note that historic structures are exempt from the elevation requirements. And then finally, in the redevelopment section, there are two provisions allowing flood control. The highly developed areas is sort of defined as areas where the impervious surfaces predominantly have replaced natural floodplain functions. So, and one would allow fill for flood control purposes in the minimal wave action zone, probably berms there. And then there's a provision allowing elevation of existing seawalls or construction of berms for flood control in the velocity or moderate wave action zone conducted or supported by a public agency. That's to be sure it's part of a sort of cohesive flood control plan. Flood control does have to be coordinated in order to be effective. And there's some other provisions about being sure that the flooding won't affect other properties. Next slide. Okay, there's an provision which I'd encourage you to take a look at that it would allow within land subject to coastal storm flowage that would allow work that would allow migration of either salt marsh or dune onto land subject to coastal storm flowage. And the idea here is that it could be very beneficial to property owners as well as to allow passive or active migration onto land subject to coastal storm flowage. They try to increase the benefits of flood control and storm damage prevention that those resource areas provide. And finally, there's a provision about protection of rare species habitat, similar to all the other coastal regulations. Next slide. Okay, there is an important new provision that applies generally for all coastal resource areas, and I'm moving on from land subject to coastal storm flowage, then provisions that apply more generally to the coastal resource areas. And I've quoted the opening sentence to it here. Again, it's located at 10.24, which is the general provisions that apply to coastal resource areas. And this provision is really aimed at increasing restoration, enhancement, or creation of wetlands resource areas to provide shoreline protection as an alternative to hard structures. I really want to emphasize here that whatever work that goes on under this provision, again, we really are encouraging nature-based solutions along the shoreline, that the plan be based on the characteristics of the site. And we have some particular provisions about tidal range bathymetry, intertidal slope, wave energy. That's very important that it be planned carefully so it will be effective. And there's some other requirements in here to make sure that it allows conversion of resource areas, but protects salt marsh and primary dunes. And the whole purpose of this really is to promote the capacity of our resource areas to provide good flood control and storm damage prevention to property owners along the coast, which many property owners are very interested in. As to resources, we cite to resilientmass.org, where they can take sea level rise and other things into account in planning those projects. Next slide.
Pam, time check.
Yep, okay. All right, I'm almost finished up here. We have a couple of new limited projects. One is for road elevation. There are many areas where roads will need to be elevated, so there's some provision for that, and also for road relocation and reconfiguration of water dependent use projects. So and obviously water dependent use projects is a larger category, it's a defined term. And so that will apply to more projects. So have a look at those. Those were things that were coming up fairly frequently for municipal vulnerability planning as projects that were good candidates for a limited project status. Next slide. Okay, last but not least, there is a pathway for scientific research on various to test hypotheses around how wetlands resources will respond to climate change, and this will be is fairly specialized. So the number of projects could come in under this probably will be limited. But those of you who are interested in scientific research should take a look at these. There's some limitations on impacts and duration and restoration being put in place depending on what the results are, but I encourage you to take a look at those. All right, thank you. Passing along the baton.
Thanks, Pam. So this is the schedule for our regulation comment period. They were published on December 22nd, 2023. This is the last of the scheduled information sessions, and the public hearings start next week. There'll be two next week on January 31st and one on February 1st. And those public hearings will be for taking comment, not like a question and answer session like today. And the comment period ends on March 1st. Next slide, Pam. And then this slide, we'll leave this up, and this slide will just tells you how you can, submit your formal comments. And so it's, as Stephanie said earlier in this session, it's very important that you, submit written comments, even if you were here today, like, and submitted questions and answers. So really pleased that it's now 1:30 and we've left a full 30 minutes for folks to ask questions. And you can either put them in the chat or you can raise your hand, and we'll do our very best to get through as many as we can and to answer as many as we can. Is there anything in the chat, or?
I see no hands yet, but there are some things in the chat. Rebecca Haney has already responded to a request to some links to the FEMA Map Service Center. Brittany Dorienzo asks, is there a measurement for the definition of predominant for impervious surfaces?
Is there a measurement?
Yeah. That is not currently defined, and we welcome comments on that question. We did spend a fair amount of time trying to decide exactly how to define that. Obviously, it'll be different in different communities. Some communities have sort of more robust downtown areas, but that it's not defined at the present time.
Great.
Yeah, and so as with almost every response, we'll tag on at the end, and please include that in your official comment when you submit. Let's take one more from the chat, and then we'll go to the raised hands.
Okay.
Cass Paganelli asks, given the roadway elevation limited project, is there consideration for railway elevation as well, and if not, why?
I'm quite sure that. Or the road, the public transportation transportation is included in the relocation and for roadways. So it is included in that limited project. I think the other one applies only to roads, but I'm not sure. Maybe Lisa, you can confirm that.
I believe it only applies to roads.
Yeah.
And, feel free to submit that comment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other one, the one for relocation of roads definitely includes public transportation.
All right.
All right.
Will you
Lisa, you want to go to some hands?
Sure. Are they numbered?
In the participants list, if you call that up, they come up in order. So in order, it's Adam Brodsky, Heidi Ritchie, and Andrea Chasen.
Okay, we'll go first to Adam. Hi, Adam.
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Brodsky. I'm an environmental attorney on the South Shore, and the performance standards appear to be inconsistent with the current building code, which is the 9th edition. And how are we going to reconcile that, please?
Let's see, Pam, do you want to?
Yeah, actually, the building code is kind of a moving target, and because I believe that there's some proposals out that actually would raise the amount over base flood elevation further than it is now. But our provision refers to the height, the elevation height for the dune or whichever is higher. So I think we're going to stick with the high, whichever is higher requirement. But that's actually would be you're welcome to send comments in on that as well. But I think we'll probably go with whichever is higher. Obviously, we can't go lower than the building code. So.
Right. I mean, they're different. They're also different purposes. So the Wetlands Protection Act, the goals are to protect the function of the floodplain. And so I would imagine it's, the stricter of the two or the higher of the two, as Pam put it.
Yeah.
So the current building code allows construction within the velocity zone, and your performance standards are going to prohibit construction in the velocity zone. So that's a
that's the difference in siting. Yes, that is an inconsistency.
For new structures.
Yeah, for new structures.
Not for redevelopment, but for new structures. Okay, next is Heidi, I believe. Hi, Heidi.
Hi, Lisa and all. Thank you all again for all of this. My question is related to the two new limited projects related to roads, and then the broader one for all public transportation infrastructure. On the one for elevating roads, it does allow some unavoidable impacts to salt marsh, and then it requires restoration or creation, and the standard is similar to other mitigation already, replication requiring 75% coverage. Just wondering there, so this is first of two questions, wondering there whether you've considered connecting those projects to, larger restoration projects. It just like, where is this restoration gonna take place? Is there any thought into that? Or it's just sort of like left to whatever planning is done for these projects? Are you thinking about more generally, what can we do to make our infrastructure more resilient and our salt marshes more resilient? Can we connect these two things?
So are you talking about the mitigation or about the design of the roadway itself?
Yeah, about the mitigation, because I'm just wondering, are we going to end up with like the new little patches of attempts at salt marsh restoration in various dispersed locations versus really well-planned as part of like the resilient coast, where they're talking about planning on a district level. And so are we thinking about connecting these limited projects, this one and the other one, to that like resilience coast, more comprehensive planning kind of thing? Have you thought about that at all?
Not specifically, because we don't really have a banking program in the state, but we do have like, I mean, for projects, that are limited projects, there are options, allowed, beyond just the straight replacement. So that may be a possibility, right? And it'll depend on the timing of the project as well.
Yeah.
So that, so all those things would have to be, taken into account on a project by project basis.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's helpful. So the second question was related to the relocation of roads and railroads, where the standard is more stringent, and you're saying they have to comply with the existing salt marsh standards. Just wonder if there's a road that right now runs through a road or a railroad that right now runs through salt marsh, and it's relocated landward, maybe impacting other resources, but relocating it out of that really vulnerable coastal location. And then part of your requirement is to restore the, where it was previously located to what it should be, which in that case would be salt marsh. But you're not allowing them to alter salt marsh. I mean, how would you remove a road or railroad that's running through the salt marsh without altering some of the marsh in the process of trying to do that removal and restoration?
Yeah.
And that may be more in the nature of a comment that I'll put in my written comments as well, but it's
Yeah,
not something I'm objecting to. I'm just wondering how it's going to work.
that's right. That would be a good comment to make. I mean, I think that the main thing we were trying to get people to think about is, that in relocating, a roadway, which is kind of a major undertaking, you should be looking at existing routes rather than through a nice, healthy salt marsh. So that was kind of one of the big things we were trying to accomplish with that.
Thanks.
Great. The next question is from Andrea Chasen, and having looked in the chat, let me just offer one sort of really high level remark, and then Andrea can unmute herself and ask her question. And this has happened, or this has come up at other information sessions. So as between the proposed regulations that we're talking about in terms of affecting the coast versus those that are related perhaps to inland impacts. And so I think that one of the simplest way to think about this is that the coastal floodplain, or land subject to coastal storm flowage, is a wetland resource area for which we have not previously had performance standards. And so these regulations are proposing to add those performance standards. And so therefore they do apply only to that resource area along the coast. Whereas in the next presentation, we're going to be talking about precipitation and stormwater management. And of course, it rains everywhere. So those apply throughout the state. So if that's a really overly simplistic distinction, but hopefully helpful to some. And with that, I'll be quiet and let Andrea ask her question.
Thank you. That actually does address it, although I'd like to know when the other public sessions are, because my town is along the Connecticut River. And as you can remember from this past summer, we had intense flooding up and down. All the properties adjacent, farms went under, but we also have a lot of infrastructure that borders the Connecticut River. And so it is precipitation, and then it's flow and all sorts of other problems. So I'm looking forward to the impact, or the regulations impacting the coastal areas, the inland areas rather.
Yeah, that'll be at roughly 2:00 when we get through this question and answer session. We'll go through the stormwater standards. There is a minor change to the inland floodplain standard as well. So we'll go through that then. Okay, Joanne.
Hi, I'm Joanne
Yeah.
Muramoto. I'm with the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. I have two questions, if you will. The first one is about proposed salt marsh restoration using methods such as thin layer replacement or runneling or ditch remediation. Under what kind of category would these activities be considered? Under research?
They could be, considered under research, under the scientific research projects. MassDEP is working on the next iteration of the wetland regulations after this one that would include more proposals for those types of ecological restoration activities.
Okay, that's good to know. Do you happen to know a time frame for that?
It would be hopefully this year. That's the schedule.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's good news. Okay. My second question concerns the nature-based shoreline protection requirement, which one of the standards would allow conversion of one resource area type to another. Is this meant to apply only to land subject to coastal storm flowage areas only, or where LSCSF overlaps with another resource area?
Pam, go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually in the general provision, so it would apply actually in all coastal. It would apply to all coastal resource areas. So, for example, you could convert land underwater to salt marsh or dune or beach or something like that, if it's appropriate. Again, it's really important that these, when you're looking at a site, that that whatever the work that you're going to do to provide additional shoreline protection would be appropriate to the site.
And what determines what is an appropriate method of increasing resilience? Is there, say, a graded list of resource areas that conversion to would increase resilience, or is that left to a presumption?
Yeah, there's not a list of resource areas. What there is in the proposed regulations is a shortened list of features of the site that may help decide what kind of project would be appropriate there. And the department is also working on additional guidance around living shorelines, so that may assist as well. But we did look to the Northeast Regional Ocean Council, did some work on this and had some site characteristics that I mentioned briefly about bathymetry and the tidal range and wave energy and things like that at the site that can help guide applicants and property owners to something that's appropriate to that part of the coast.
Okay, thank
Great,
you.
thank you.
Right. We currently have the coastal manual, which is up on the website, and we are going to be working on a simplified guide for conservation commissions, and as Pam mentioned, the guidance for living shorelines. Next, should
All right.
we?
Yeah, I'm trolling back up in the chat here, and this may be one for Rebecca. There still seems to be some confusion about how the FEMA maps delineate or show the demarcation between MOA, LIMWA, MEWA. And I believe that's taken care of in the link that Rebecca Haney from CZM put in the chat before. But Melissa Kaplan, is there a specific question you had about that? Melissa said in the chat that many times these resource areas are not defined on FEMA maps, and what's the protocol then?
So Stephanie, this is Rebecca Haney. I can take that.
Thank you.
We updated the FEMA flood maps so that there are LIMWAs delineated for the entire coast. So all coastal communities in Massachusetts had those added to the maps in 2017. They do not show up in the FEMA flood layer that you download onto your town GIS or to the state GIS. You need to go to the FEMA Map Service Center. The LIMWA is shown on the maps. It does not say MOA. It does not say MEWA. it will have the LIMWA, and that separates those zones. So there is additional guidance that's been developed already on that, and we'll be putting a handout up on DEP's website soon that helps you to find that. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And
Thank
I
you.
want to let everyone know that Rebecca Haney from the Mass Office of Coastal Zone Management has been a very valued advisor to us throughout this process. So she's here to help us answer questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. Brian Grady asked a question. I'm not sure I understand, but it's about 1036.8C, and it describes a building must be it's about what determines, I think, redevelopment must be reconstructed and received an occupancy permit prior to the effective date of the regulations. Does that mean if someone is a year into the project that they couldn't finish it? So.
I think on this, there is, just for those of you who may not have delved at that level of detail into the regulations, there is a provision about buildings in the velocity zone that have been substantially damaged, or that they can be elevated. The building can be reconstructed on open piles, provided that if the building was constructed and received an occupancy permit prior to the effective date of these regulations. And we would welcome comment on that about how far we selected occupancy permit as, you know, good point of demarcation. The purpose of this actually is to try to reduce repetitive damage and try to not have buildings continue to be reconstructed in the velocity zone and damaged again. So that's what that's the purpose of it. But comment if you think that point that there are other places in regulations where there's a point after which, you know, where something becomes applicable, and comments on that would be welcome.
Terrific. I don't see any hands yet either, so I'm sticking to the chat, and Tori just brought to our attention that there's something in the Q&A as well, so we'll go take a look at that. Shyla Davis asks two related questions, and Shyla, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask them. Basically,
Hi, sure. Yeah, thank you so much again for having this. I was just curious, I do a lot of work primarily with utility infrastructure, maintenance and replacements, and handling wetland permitting. So I just was curious if this would impact any of the current exemptions for, you know, utility infrastructure maintenance, or if there would be any additional forms, you know, in addition to existing forms such as, you know, the NOI application or similar.
So this won't affect existing exemptions.
Mm-hmm.
Those are statutory. The utility, if you're talking about the utility maintenance exemptions.
Yes.
The applications, you know, when the regs are promulgated, whatever's filed after that would have to comply. So the coastal regulations would be effective immediately. The stormwater regulations are proposed to be effective 6 months after promulgation, to allow for projects in the pipeline. So that's the proposal, and you may want to comment on that. Did you want to ask the next question, or did I answer them both?
Yeah, I think that answers it. Yeah, so it sounds like there's no additional permits needed. It's just going to be continue to file the same way, but with new restrictions to comply with. Okay, wonderful.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Sure.
Likewise. Let me turn to the item from Arlene Wilson in the Q&A. It's more about the question of lines on FEMA maps and the demarcation between LIMWA, et cetera. Essentially, it says we've run into a situation where the LIMWA is actually shown at the BE limit instead of between AE sections. What do we do with that? That's a fairly specific question, and I'm tempted to say to look at the link that Rebecca Haney put in the chat up above. But Rebecca, do you want to have a quick swipe at that one?
I can quickly answer that.
Thank
So
you.
there's not always going to be a MOA zone. If the Limwa falls on the boundary between the V and the A, then there's no MOA. So there are going to be a lot of cases like that. There's actually relatively few MOAs along the coast.
Excellent, thank you.
Good answer. Okay, next, Stephanie, are we going,
Yeah,
we're
let's go to the one hand that's up right now. That's Julia Godfredson.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, Julia Godfredson. I work for the City of Newburyport for the Conservation Commission. And I have a question about new development. You mentioned that, so V zone, there's no adverse effect, no new buildings, even on piles. And then in the MOA, no adverse effect, and there must be unobstructed flow and elevation above baselevel elevation plus 2 feet. But I'm just wondering, and then for redevelopment, you said that there's fill for flood control is allowed in the minimum wave action zone. For redevelopment, would there be fill for flood control allowed in the, should I assume that there's no fill for flood control allowed in the moderate wave action zone?
I think it's important to clarify that those two provisions about flood control apply in areas that are where they're predominantly have lost their floodplain function. So I do want to be clear about that. So it's not, it's not generally applicable anywhere. It does have that limitation to it.
Right. So I guess maybe I didn't state my question well enough because I was mixing two things together. But in the moderate wave action zone on a redevelopment site, there can be no fill allowed for flood control.
So Julia, one of the key provisions for the MOA zone is that the project doesn't divert floodwaters to adjacent properties. That doesn't cause flow channelization and that sort of thing. There may be instances where a small amount of fill could be allowed. So it's and there's also a provision for flood control structures that are promoted by the municipality or supported by the municipality. And I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to add anything to that.
I guess maybe it helps if I explain why I'm asking, because we have an area on our waterfront that's largely undeveloped, boat storage, whatever, that kind of thing. And a lot of that area is in the moderate wave action zone. If it were to be redeveloped for condos or whatever, any of the structures would be elevated, but would they also be allowed to fill to sort of manage the site for sea level rise over time?
So,
or would they be restricted from doing that in the moderate wave action zone?
Julia, I think it's important to look at whether the fill would redirect flow onto adjacent areas. And
Okay.
that's some of the flow path analysis that we've asked in some questions in MIPA. We would be working with DEP on developing guidance on how to do that and how for Concom's how to review it.
Okay. So because we would have to look at that, and we're not engineers, obviously, commissioners.
Yep.
Okay, so as long as there'd be some technical assistance around that to help us evaluate it. So the answer kind of is maybe, it sounds like.
There may be instances, where a small amounts of fill could be allowed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's difficult to answer questions sort of about a particular site and project too. So yeah. But it's fine in your comments. I mean, I would encourage, anyone who has comments about a particular site to sort of focus on that and see how you read the regulations to apply or not apply to your site, and then comment on how you think they should or should not apply to your site.
Okay.
That kind of thing can be quite helpful in a particular case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Are we doing on time, Lisa?
We have 3 more minutes.
So we only have a few questions left in the chat. Let's try to see if we can get through them quickly. Jonathan Nero, feel free to unmute yourself, asks about 1036-6 about the prohibition of new construction in the B zone, but it allows walkways. Does that strictly refer to at-grade walkways? What about pile-supported walkways?
Right. Walkways are allowed in the regulations for the proposed regulations for the MOA zone. I believe it's section 10.366.
Yeah.
There's a section on what is allowed in the V and MOA zone. It's I believe it's section 10.366.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. I guess my question was also kind of specifically on pile supported walkways, since you have prohibitions on pile supported buildings as well as allowances for walkways. So I didn't know where pile supported walkways.
Yeah, well, I mean, pile supported walkways are specifically listed in the
Okay.
regulations as allowed. You know, I mean, they wouldn't with just walkways. I think it could be pile supported or at grade, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think we specified either way. If you have a comment on what we should have done there, that would be welcome, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
Our own Phil DePietro asks us.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, how's it
Hey,
going?
Phil.
Good.
Is wanting a brief re-description of the exception on the limited project provision that mentions boathouse and boatyard projects.
Yeah, it went by quickly on the discussion, so I was just wondering what are the specifics on that?
Okay, for the water dependent use, new limited project?
Was that what it was? There was
I
something
think it's
specifically about boathouses or boatyards.
Yeah, Pam, I think it's
I
either
have a case right now that I was looking at, so.
Pam, I think it's in 10.366, possibly in that
Okay,
section.
and for the it's an allowable activity in the V or MOA zone, is that what
Yeah, I
you're
think so,
referring
yeah.
to?
I believe
Yeah,
so.
okay, yes. There is a provision there which would allow the same list of activities in the velocity zone and the moderate wave action zone that includes, it does include elevated open rack storage for boats. Does include that, and then some other navigational aids and things like that. It has a number of things that are that would be allowed.
But the building itself should be elevated, right?
Yeah, the building is, there's a list of sort of activities that are, that includes the pedestrian walkways and things like that. It does not include the buildings as a separate provision for the V zone does not allow buildings, even if elevated on piles for new development. And then that would be allowed in the moderate wave action zone.
I believe it says open storage, like open boat storage.
Yeah.
What about redevelopment of an existing boathouse? Does that have to be elevated or not?
It depends what zone it's in.
Hmm.
Yeah, but for the most part, it would be.
It should be, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Right, so if it's a new structure in the MOA zone, it would be, well, for redevelopment, right, it could be redeveloped. And then there's certain criteria for how, it would need to be redeveloped, like not closer to the ocean, that sort of thing. But yeah, so that's specified in the standards, like what would apply under 10.368 is the redevelopment standards.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you.
There are 2 more questions if we want to take them, but Lisa, I'll let you.
Okay,
decide.
well, let's see, why don't we quickly.
So one from Michelle Green is a sort of a general question, might be good clarification about where does LSCSF actually apply? Is it only to areas mapped by CZM? And for example, she says in West Newbury, we're not mapped as a coastal on the CZM maps, but have tidally influenced Merrimack River. So this is sort of basic. I think this is a really basic question about what is the jurisdictional area of land subject to coastal storm flowage, and where can she see that?
Yeah.
Well, it's map, it's based on the FEMA maps, so it's zone A, the V and the A zone based on the FEMA maps. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure, because I don't see the question in chat, so I'm not sure where it is.
It's the third from the bottom.
Oh,
Michelle Green.
Lisa, I think this is very similar to one we talked about recently. The coastal land subject to coastal storm flowage extends up the river until the floodway or riverine flood mapping shows up on the FEMA map. So no, it's not the CZ boundary for CZM.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
okay,
Yeah.
sure. And then there was one more. Is that the one
Well,
about?
there was actually two more. One from Joe Pesnola, who, I'm sorry to chuckle, he asked for a red line version of the stormwater handbook. And Joe, what I can say, or what we can say, is the prior edition of the stormwater handbook, shall we say, was not the most elegant thing in the world, and needed sort of a makeover. And so oh good, you're giggling. Okay. We thought about putting up a red line, but in fact, the entire format and organization of the stormwater handbook has been revised to be much more user friendly, much more obviously organized. So
and I understand and appreciate that. And chapter 2 is much better and concise, and I can read chapter 2 and get a lot of good information from that. What I'm interested in is volume 2, chapter 2, which is now appendix A. And it is very parallel to the two documents are very similar. They have the BMPs broken out into sections, whether they be infiltration practices or conveyance practices, but there are changes, substantive changes within that text.
You're looking for the SCM fact sheets.
Right. And red lines of those would be super important to us to be able to understand what is being what is being changed. As you know, the handbook is regulation, so we need to all read it as regulation, and we need to understand exactly where and ask why there are changes to that to those sections in the execution of the design of BMPs.
If we're able to do that, I'm not sure. I'll have to look into that and see if that's possible. So that's, if it is possible, and Dave Roman's here. I don't know, Dave, what you think, but if it is possible, we could try posting those fact sheets, on the web. But the one more thing I wanted to point out is that the stormwater handbook is presumed to be the stormwater handbook is presumed to meet the regulations, but it is not regulation. Okay.
That's not the message that I have gotten in the past from Mr. McGuire. So maybe that can be clarified, and that's important. But discussions that I've had with Mr. McGuire is that the handbook has the power of regulation. So if something within one of those BMP sheets says must or shall, it has the effect of regulation, and deviation from that requirement is not something that the local conservation commissions can waive. That would take a DEP variance.
That's correct.
Can I just weigh in?
No,
This is the LSC.
Tom.
Okay.
Hi, Tom.
You're correct, Joe, that if it says shall in the handbook, then MassDEP determined that it is in the reg, but otherwise it's presumed to meet the standards. So that is what MassDEP will rely on in you know, its own decisions. So that's really,
No,
yeah.
right.
So
and
just
it's
one thing to throw in,
right,
Lisa,
right.
just to
So
add to that, if I may, Joe.
just to
We need
finish
to
my
move
point.
on to the presentation, Tom, but you'll have a chance,
Okay.
you know,
Well,
later.
well, Joe, are you hanging around for the second part of the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, I'll answer that then.
All right,
Okay.
Tom, thanks.
I don't know if we want to, why don't we take, is the last one?
We had one more question about how do the proposed regulations affect permitting of new coastal engineering structures? Seems to allow increase in size of existing CESs, but what about new ones? What about pre-1978, post-1978, and gap structures? This is from Karen Strauss.
I think I'll ask Jill. Like, Jill, do you want to take that one?
Sorry, I'm in the office and was distracted. So could you read?
Yeah, the question is, how do the proposed regulations affect permitting of new coastal engineering structures? It seems to allow an increase in size of existing CESs, but what about new ones? And is there anything we can say about pre-1978, post-1978, or gap projects?
Right, I mean, you also have to look to the Coastal Bank performance standards here, and there is an allowance for the construction of a coastal engineering structure for pre-78 structure, so I don't know if that answers the question about being able to put up new.
So these new regulations don't change the standards as they pertain to coastal engineering structures, except that there, you know, are a few allowances for fill and like elevation of seawalls and berms, like in the MOA and MEWA zone that we talked about already. Does that answer your question, Karen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And then what about the landwards? What about the landward side? Would there be a spot where the A flood zone actual gets influence from an inland stream and is BLSF, and a portion is LSCSF?
Lisa, I mean, I can think of this scenario up in the Merrimack River where the FEMA has determined, I forget what the name of the bridge is up in the Merrimack, where they put the cutoff for LSCSF and BLSF. I think it's the Cut Bridge, I could be wrong, but it's based on the amount of salinity and that there's more riverine characteristics. So I'm sure you're going to see that on many streams that flow into the ocean, but they have made that distinction.
All right, we're going to have to move on to stormwater. So thank you everyone for those great questions. And now we have a presentation on stormwater, the updates. This will go about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of the time that we have on your questions for stormwater. So I just want to introduce the others who will be presenting with me, and that includes Tom McGuire and Elizabeth Clark, both from MassDEP, and also our special guest, Dave Roman, from Comprehensive Environmental, and they helped us put together the Stormwater Handbook, which is now online and available for folks to look at. Next slide. So the agenda of the next few minutes will be, I'll give a high-level overview of the regulation changes and standards 2, 3, 4, and 7, which are the main standards we have made changes to. Then we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into standards 2, 3, 4, and 7. We'll discuss a proposed new standard, 11. We'll give an overview of new environmentally sensitive site design credits. Then we'll preview the draft stormwater handbook, and we'll do questions and answers. Next slide. So the main goals of the stormwater update are, and the first and foremost is to update the outdated precipitation data with current data that reflects increasing storms. And the current data is well over 60 years old, and so this is badly needed. We are also, our goals are to align with the EPA MS4 permit as best as we can, to promote nature-based, environmentally sensitive site design, and also to update the stormwater handbook, which is now over 15 years old. And like I said, that's available on our website and available for comment as well. Next slide. So this shows the current standards. We currently have 10 stormwater standards, and we're proposing one new one, which would be to support compliance with TMDLs. The standards 2, 3, 4, and 7 are the standards we'll be most focused on in this presentation, since those are the ones where we made the most changes to. That's peak discharge rates, groundwater recharge, pollutant removal for new development, and redevelopment. Okay, next slide. So starting with the stormwater standard 2, which is a standard for peak runoff attenuation. And the current standard is that stormwater management systems have to be designed so post-development peak discharge rates don't exceed pre-development discharge rates, peak discharge rates. And the current, this standard's not going to change, but the current standard is based on precipitation data from a very old atlas, precipitation atlas, referred to as Technical Paper 40, which was published in 1960. And we are proposing to discontinue use of that and to adopt the NOAA 14 atlas that was published in 2015 and updated in 2019. Only rather than use the fitted or average value of the NOAA Atlas, we are proposing to use the 90% of the published upper confidence interval to reflect current extreme precipitation. And that we refer to that as NOAA Plus. We are also proposing to require the 2 and 10-year storms like today, but also the 100-year storm for design. For redevelopment projects, it's currently a maximum extent practicable standard, and we're proposing that it remain a maximum extent practicable standard, except that it would be NOAA plus precipitation to the maximum extent practicable. Next slide. Okay, so standard 3 of the stormwater standards is for recharge. And the standard requires that at a minimum, annual recharge from the post-development site shall approximate annual recharge from the pre-development site. And that's based on soil type. So the current recharge standard has different requirements for A soils, B, C, and D soils all the way through. The proposed standard would be to have for A, B, and C soils, the recharge required would be 1 inch if you're using the static method. And if you have D soils, you would need to recharge 1 inch to the maximum extent practicable. And we are also proposing to allow additional methods to design the recharge, including the dynamic and continuous simulation methods that would be presumed to meet the 1 inch. For redevelopment, it's currently a maximum extent practicable standard, and we are proposing that it continue to be a maximum extent practicable standard, except that it would be 1 inch to the maximum extent practicable, assuming you're using the static method. And then we are also proposing that off-site mitigation is allowed for redevelopment for recharge. Next slide. And then standard 4 is the pollutant removal standard, and this is the one that was most important to try to align with EPA. So the current standard is to remove 80% of the average annual load of total suspended solids. And the proposed standard would be to remove 90% total suspended solids and 60% total phosphorus, which is aligned with EPA MS4 general permit. However, we're proposing for new development that offsite mitigation not be allowed, since but you're dealing with a new site, so you should be able to design for that. For redevelopment, the current standard is a maximum extent practicable standard, and we're proposing that it be 80% total suspended solids removal and 50% total phosphorus removal, similar to EPA. Except we are proposing that for most projects, they would need to fully meet the standard rather than for it to be a maximum extent practicable standard. And we'll discuss the reasons for that in a few minutes. We're also proposing to allow offsite mitigation for redevelopment projects for this standard. And then I believe now we're going to start our deeper dive into these standards, and I'm going to turn this over to Tom McGuire to talk about the peak stormwater runoff standard. Tom, you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to be reiterating a lot of the information that Lisa discussed earlier. Right now, we rely on technical paper 40 that was published in 1961. It's a paper format. I think there's like 2 or 3 ISO heights, which are lines of equal precipitation in Massachusetts. Parties, had to interpolate. It's very difficult because there was no map just for Massachusetts, except one that was made by the NRCS. So we're proposing to use NOAA 14, which is a web-based interface where you can point and click on any spot in the state. Excuse me. And precipitation statistics are generated for that one particular point in space, so no interpolation is necessary. We're going to be proposing to use an additional increment, which I'll discuss in a second, we call NOAA Plus. Next slide. So when you click on any point in space in Massachusetts, you're going to get this table. You can see the table here. And there's sort of 3 values in each cell. There's the fitted value, which is the value in bold, in this case, 7.88. And then there's values below that in parentheses. In this case, 5.96 would be the lower confidence, and 10.7 is the upper confidence. What we're proposing to use is a variation of the upper confidence to account for the higher amounts of precipitation that we're actually experiencing and seeing. So in this case, we would take the value of 10.7, we'd multiply it by 0.9, and that's the value we would use for design. So we wouldn't use 7.88, we'd use 9.63, which you can see on the left in the example. Next slide. We're proposing to make a similar change in borderland subject to flooding. Right now with borderland subject to flooding, we're going to be proposing to continue to rely on the FEMA flood insurance profiles. And then in the event that there is no flood profile for a particular area, which often happens with BVW, we're proposing to continue to rely on the largest event observed or recorded, and then in the event of a conflict, an engineering analysis, except that you would use NOAA Plus instead of the 7-inch storm in 24 hours. Just a quick note, because this has come up in a couple of other presentations. Right now, we rely on a type 3 storm, and the storm distributions are changing. The NRCS has changed them to NOAA B and NOAA C, and we're going to be publishing an online tool as part of this proposed regulation change where parties can find out if their town is in B or C or both, because we're no longer going to be relying on a type 3 storm. Now turn over to Dave Roman.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So now we'll go into standard 3, which focuses on stormwater recharge. So as Lisa mentioned, the 2008 regulations require that the recharge depth is based on hydrologic soil group. So for example, if you're using the static method for group A, it would be 0.6 inches. For group D, it would be 0.1 inches. The proposed regulations for the static method increase this recharge depth to 1 inch for all soil types, except for D, which should be 1 inch to the maximum extent practicable. There are a couple of dynamic methods that can be used to lower this recharge depth. And essentially, this dynamic sizing can result in smaller stormwater control measures than static sizing because it considers the hydraulic conductivity. So there's a couple of methods currently in the handbook. Those are the simple dynamic and the dynamic field method. And the draft handbook includes a third method called the continuous simulation method. This would be a spreadsheet-based method that looks at long-term rainfall records near the site. One thing to note is that DEP did evaluate this 1 inch target recharge value based on comments from the advisory committee. And as a result of that, 2 analyses were performed. One was a base flow separation analysis. One was a continuous rainfall simulation analysis. And based on this, DEP is considering to change that recommendation from 1 inch to 0.8 inches. So there is some more information on this at the link at the bottom of this slide, but DEP is welcoming comments on this possible change. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liz to talk about Standard 4.
Thanks, Dave. I am Liz Clark. I'm going to walk you through the changes to Standard 4 and go over the new Standard 11. Standard 4 was updated with 2 main goals in mind. One was to increase the water quality from stormwater runoff coming off of our new and redeveloped sites. We've seen over 224 water bodies in the Commonwealth become impaired due to stormwater contaminants in the past 5 years. Additionally, we are trying to align to the extent possible with the 2016 MS4 permit. 74% of the communities in Massachusetts are subject to the permit conditions, and it does have higher post-construction stormwater management standards in it. Next slide. So the changes in the standards. Currently, we have a requirement to remove 80% total suspended solids for new developments and to the maximum extent for redevelopments. And the standard is moving to increase that TSS removal requirement to 90% for new development. And we're adding in a nutrient reduction standard of 60% average annual total phosphorus. For redevelopment, this was, again, 80% TSS removal to the maximum extent practicable. The standard is going to move to a required 80% TSS removal and a 50% total phosphorus removal for redevelopments. There is an offsite mitigation allowed for redevelopment, and you have to first demonstrate that through an alternatives analysis that this cannot be met on site. The site cannot be a LUPL or discharged to a critical area. And if you meet that criteria, then you can start evaluating your offsite mitigation, starting with the closest radius of a site near to your site, and expanding out to the HUC 10, Hydrologic Unit Code 10. And those watersheds are available on MassMapper if you'd like to see them. Next slide. There are exemptions still allowed for redevelopment, and these are substantially aligned with what was in the 2008 Stormwater Handbook. So the stormwater standards do not apply to single-family developments of 4 or less units or lots that do not discharge to critical areas, emergency repairs, and an added condition is gardens with no impervious areas. Projects that are allowed to apply to the maximum extent practicable are single-family developments of 4 or less units or lots that discharge to a critical area, 5 to 9 units or lots that do not discharge to a critical area, unpaved paths that are not subject to vehicular traffic, marinas, boatyards, and roadway maintenance. Next slide. So meeting the standards. There is a table in the draft handbook table 2-2 that shows a crosswalk of how you are going to calculate compliance with standard 4. The first option is to use the environmental site sensitive design credits, which Dave is going to cover in just a minute to meet the requirements. Or you're going to look at the EPA performance curves. These are the same curves that are included in Appendix F of the MS4 permit that show the pollutant removal for the associated with the volume of water treated. Or there's the option 3, which is the MassDEP pollutant removal credits, such as 25% TSS removal for a catch basin. Next slide. So this is an example of the pollutant removal curves. These are now included in Appendix B of the draft handbook. Again, you can also find them in the MS4 permit, and the EPA also has a BMP BAT tool, which has these in them. The dark blue line at the top is your total suspended solids removal. The dark orange is your total phosphorus. Your load reduction is seen on your y-axis going up the page, and down on the bottom is the depth of runoff times the impervious area. So it'd be 1 inch times the impervious area tributary to the stormwater control measure. And you can evaluate sizing in 2 different ways here. The first would be to evaluate your sizing just based upon meeting standard 4, the 90% TSS and 60% total phosphorus. You can see here with this scenario, you would need to treat about 0.4 inches across your impervious area that are tributary to the stormwater control measure. Or you can take a look at meeting the full 1 inch of the recharge, which is now shown in red, and that bumps these pollutant removal rates up significantly to almost 100% TSS and in excess of 90% total phosphorus removal. Next slide. So Standard 11 was also designed with the intent of enhancing and improving the water quality coming off of our new and redeveloped sites. It applies to projects that are tributary to waters with a TMDL, specifically 4 different TMDLs. It's nutrients, so that'd be nitrogen or phosphorus, fecal indicator bacteria, which would also include pathogens, fecal coliforms, and E. coli, and then metal TMDLs, zinc, cadmium, lead, aluminum, and iron. It does not apply to the North Coastal Mercury TMDL. The intent of this standard can be met if you meet standard 3 and 4, and then use the appropriate stormwater control measures that will help treat the pollutant of concern. And if you also update the long-term pollution prevention plan to address the pollutant of concern. So if you had a nutrient TMDL, you're going to need a nutrient management plan in your long-term pollution prevention plan. Next slide. So knowing if you need to comply with Standard 11, there is a viewer. The link is here. Again, these slides will be posted on our website to show you if you have an applicable TMDL. You can also get this information off of MassMapper. Next slide. And here is table 2-6, which is in the draft handbook, that shows which stormwater control measures achieve pollutant removal for the specific pollutants. So you have your TSS, your total nitrogen, your total phosphorus, fecal indicator bacteria, and metals. Going down, it does show you with yes or no, or varies if the stormwater control measures are applicable. And I'll turn it back over to you, Dave.
All right, thanks, Liz. And I know that we're getting kind of short on time here, so I'll try to go quick so we have time to answer lots of questions. So there is a new proposed requirement that environmentally sensitive site design, ESSD, and low impact development techniques must be used to attenuate stormwater. So really what that means is that, ESSD and LID techniques, must be used to meet certain standards, such as standard 3 for recharge and standard 4 for pollutant removal. So to help kind of applicants meet this new requirement, there have been some ESSD credits that have been updated and added. So the 2008 handbook had 3 LID credits. So those have been retained, but have been updated to make them a bit easier to use. There are also 4 completely new ESSD credits. And then finally, the handbook includes an expanded list of MassDEP recognized ESSD and LID techniques. This table here is just showing an overview of the 7 ESSD credits. So credit 1 is really just all about minimizing impervious surface. That's been updated from the 2008 handbook. Credit 2 is new. That's for solar projects. Credits 3 and 4 have been updated from the 2008 handbook, and that's all about disconnection of impervious surface to qualifying pervious area, like a lawn, for example. Credit 5 focuses on using tree canopy, so anything that overhangs over impervious surface, and that reduces your effective impervious area for your standard 3 and 4 calcs. Credit 6 is for redevelopment, and that's encourages reduction in impervious area. And then finally, 7 is for encouraging the use of new or existing buffer areas. So really quickly, this slide here is just showing a comparison between the 2008 handbook versus the proposed revised handbook. So really, the overall structure is very similar. The 2008 handbook was set into 3 volumes. The proposed standard is 1 document in chapters with all of the appendices at the very end. A couple things that have been changed with the draft handbook. There's a new cover page, table of contents, searchable headings, figures, tables, pop-up boxes for key concepts like what's a stormwater control measure. Calculation boxes have been standardized, so it's easy to see kind of what the required calcs are. Summary tables to help summarize information. Everything's been reformatted to make it a bit easier to follow. And then there's been a decent amount of content that's been updated to reflect the proposed changes to the standards. So, for example, for standard 2, there's new guidance on how to get the updated rainfall depths and distributions for NOAA Atlas 14+. Pollutant removal curves have been added based on the performance curves. There's new fact sheets. There's a new TMDL standard in there in chapter 2. And just a couple other things. There's a new alternatives analysis framework. Offsite mitigation has been added for standard 7. There's just some more information about how to do some of the required plans, like the construction plan, the O&M plan, new setback table, some more information on solar projects, and a chapter on highway. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lisa. You're on mute, Lisa.
Thanks, Dave. So this is for those of you who have been with us since the beginning. This is the same slide showing the schedule. This is the last scheduled information session. We have 2 public hearings scheduled on January 31st and 1 scheduled on February 1st to take public comment. Those won't be Q&A sessions like today. And the public comments are due on March 1st. Next slide, Dave. And the last slide just gives you information on how you can formally submit your comments. And as we said earlier in the session, just asking questions today doesn't take the place of submitting formal written comments. So we encourage you to do so by March 1st. And here you can see here how to do that. And so we now have about 25 minutes to go through stormwater questions. And I'm going back through the chat. I see 1 hand, so I'll let that one go. Joe Pisnola. Hi, Joe.
Yes. Hi. So if we could go back to the question I started in the last session with regards to the effect of the handbook as regulation. And I'll give a particular, for instance, the new setback table 2-8, takes setbacks that were sprinkled through volume 2, chapter 2 in the design criteria of the BMPs and consolidates it into a single table. Now, those setbacks had language associated with them that some were must or shall, some were recommendations, some were considerations. I'll give an example. In the dry detention basin, the text says in volume 2, chapter 2, the design should consider. Now, as regulation, when I'm told to consider something, it's not a must or shall. So my question is does this consolidation of all of the setbacks into table 2.8 change the status of those setbacks to must requirements that all have the full strength of regulation and are not waivable by the local conservation commission?
Right. So the setback table is now part of the regulation. So there's a table in the regulation. So it would be a regulation. We encourage you to submit comments on that if you think that there are adjustments that need to be made to that. But it would be anything that's in the regulation would be regulation, regardless of how it's phrased in the stormwater handbook. Yes. So
just briefly, my comment on that is you're tying our hands as engineers to have flexibility into our design processes and our ability to consider what the intent of the setback is and address that intent in other ways. Because you're taking the power away from the conservation commissions to enter into that kind of dialogue, analysis, and consideration, and making them not waivable, but for a DEP variance.
Is that a comment or a question?
Well, we look forward to your.
That's a comment. I'll keep the questions. My second question, and I won't monopolize the time here, so I'll just ask one more. With regards to the approach to now make the pollutant removal requirements of redevelopment required at 80/50, what is the mindset there? That is, we run into situations all the time on redevelopment sites that beg for and need the extent practicable approach because of just absolute constraints to proximity to water table, just to be able to address. And again, you're taking away the flexibility to do something in that if we can't meet the 80/50, then we do nothing. And I think it's too stark. It's too and again, the question is, I'll try to limit commentary. The question is what is the mindset there, and is there an understanding on the part of the department of what that potential is going to be for instances when we just cannot comply, on redevelopment sites?
Yes, we did think through that extensively, and the department is required. We have a federal mandate to report on the status of waters, across the Commonwealth, and the status of impaired waters is not getting better; it's getting worse, as Liz described in her presentation. And so, the current standard really, it's clear that the current standard is not working, and so. In thinking through that standard, and we, as Liz also talked about, there are quite a number of exceptions to that, for smaller developments and roadway maintenance, et cetera. But for those, redevelopment projects that cannot meet it, that absolutely cannot meet it, they can look off-site, for other options.
To this, Lisa, as well. Yeah, so it's already a requirement of the MS4 permit which again is applicable to 260 communities in the Commonwealth, 74%. In the MS4 permit, those communities are required to make a stormwater bylaw that carries the 80-50 removal. So the 80% TSS and the 50% total phosphorus. Yeah, and the EPA is starting to enforce that requirement. And I've seen a couple enforcement letters come through. So even without this change, you're going to see that in Massachusetts being implemented. And I hear you, Joe, it is a hard requirement sometimes to get that phosphorus treatment on your redeveloped sites, considering that infiltration is usually your prime method to do it. With the offsite mitigation as well, I think that's something that we're going to have to work through on how that is handled and kind of pushed out, because it is a unique situation. And there's the question of what agreements are going to be needed in place to allow that to move forward. You know, are you going to be seeking permanent easements with self-help rights in there, or can there be some sort of short-term lease agreements where you'd have to come back to the Conservation Commission if and when those are up? So.
All right, thank you, Liz. Okay, thanks, Joe, for those thoughtful comments. Okay, I guess I'll go back up to the beginning of the chat comments on stormwater. When will the proposed changes go into effect, from Conrad Nuthman? And the schedule, you know, we estimate that it would be probably by the summer. The proposal, though, is that for the stormwater part of the proposed standards would go into effect 6 months after promulgation of the regulations. So if we promulgated the regulations on July 1st, then the coastal regulations would go into effect immediately, but the stormwater regulations would go into effect 6 months later. Then there's a question from Daniel Campbell, and I think that one's been answered about maximum extent practicable. Liz, you put that citation in there, right?
Correct. And just to be clear, that citation is to the stormwater handbook. It's not to the regulation.
So question about Daniel Campbell's question about maximum extent practicable. Yes, that is defined in the stormwater handbook. I believe it also is in the regulations as well.
Lisa, there's one right above that, Tracy Olson, about NOAA 14. So Tracy Olson asks, does NOAA 14 have any projection for more extreme flooding in the future, such as the 100-year 24-hour predicted in 2070?
The answer is, the answer is no. NOAA 14 is based on existing conditions, not future conditions. There's another set of information available through Resilient Massachusetts that makes projections for 2030, 2070, 2090. But what we're proposing to use is NOAA 14, or a variation of NOAA 14, based on existing conditions.
So
and we'd welcome any comments on that if you
Yeah.
have comments about it.
Tracy, in the chat, I just dropped the flyer to NOAA 15. So NOAA has been authorized and funded to go ahead and start advancing into progressing this. And through legislation, they are now on the hook to update their storms every 10 years. And it has the timeline, I think it's 2026 that we should be seeing the completion of the continental version of it. So they're doing the entire country under this update.
And do you see DEP putting in the regulations that they'll have to follow the most current NOAA? Or are you going to be tied to NOAA 14 and then have to revise when NOAA 15 comes out?
That's right, Tracy. It's based on the NOAA 14 Atlas that's published in 2015 and updated in 2019. So
but if you think we should rely like on the RMAT projections, I mean, that would be something that you could provide a comment about to DEP.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Daniel Campbell. Are they required to the maximum extent practicable? That is a large difference. Daniel, I don't know if you can clarify, what are you talking about, a redevelopment standard?
No, during, yeah, the redevelopment standard, but during the presentation, we presented maximum extent practicable, but then we said we must comply. So which way is it? Is it the maximum extent practicable or redevelopment must comply?
Is this
Well,
for standard
it
4?
has, depending on the standard, right? Did you want to
This is
respond,
redevelopment.
Liz?
Yeah, are we talking water quality or are we talking recharge?
Both.
Okay. So for water quality, you are required to comply with the 80% TSS and the 50% total phosphorus. Again, if you're not a LUPL or a critical area, you can look at using that off-site mitigation. The maximum extent practicable only applies to those exemptions that I went through in a couple of slides ago, where it's like 4 single-family lots that discharge to a critical area, or 5 to 9 that don't. So there's a handful of exceptions that still are under the MEP. For recharge, it is, I believe, the maximum extent practicable to meet that 1 inch right now.
That's right. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I'll have to read a little bit more, but thank you.
Okay. The next question, let's see, somebody wanted a link and that's in the chat. A link to Stormwater Handbook is in the chat. Thank you for Jane Wynn. I agree with you, Jane. Thank you for getting rid of volumes and using chapters instead. I really hope that people find the new updated Stormwater Handbook to be helpful and useful in finding things. And, you know, we certainly think so. And just for everyone's information, it's on the web, on MassDEP's website, in the same location where the proposed regulations are. Heidi Ritchie, why does the policy on stormwater management for solar arrays say that management systems should be calculated based on the change in land cover, forest to grass, while at the same time recognizing that solar arrays are impervious surfaces? This provision calls for arrays to be elevated to allow vegetated growth underneath, but also recognizes the erosive impacts of drip line runoff, which is greater when arrays are higher. How does DEP reconcile these two conflicting pieces of guidance? I am going to ask either Dave Roman or Tom to reply to this.
You know, we tried to make, I mean, Dave could chip in here, but we tried to make the standard in the stormwater handbook consistent with the existing solar array policy. So we have an existing policy that allows, you know, certain types of stormwater management. So the goal here was not to overwrite the policy, but to make our stormwater standards consistent with the policy for solar arrays. I know, Dave, do you have anything to add?
Right, and are you accepting comments on the policy? That's what I asked before, because the policy was adopted without, you know, really addressing these concerns. I'm not the only one who's raised this comment.
I suggest you know, comment on it as part of this, you know, Heidi, as part of the stormwater comment, and, you know, we'll look at it and, you know, at the same time decide if we need to make other changes.
I mean, and it's more than just, if you think about it, Heidi, it's more than just the water quality for the impervious surfaces. It's also the peak rate attenuation. We might be changing a forested area to another land use. So even if we discounted the solar arrays, because we have a grassy surface beneath the trees, it's going to have a different runoff coefficient.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people are focusing in on standard number 4 for the water quality treatment, but there's also peak rate of runoff also changes very dramatically.
Yeah, that's what I'm concerned about. And you're saying on the one hand, put them high up so you can grow the grass underneath. And on the other hand, you know, watch out for drip line erosion. And those two things are in conflict. It's not recognized in the guidance. So that
I want to make sure we leave time
comments
for other questions that are directly related to the regs. So Heidi, it's great that you raised that. And as Lisa noted, please point to that in your comments.
Yeah, this is directly related to the, the handbook credits, but yeah, Heidi, feel free to send me, your comments, and also definitely submit them as part of the regulation comments. The next question is from Courtney Morehouse. How will the redevelopment standards impact sites in which there is significant SCM integration during original construction?
Courtney, could you just kind of elaborate on that? I'm not clear on the question.
I think I already answered this for myself.
Okay, can I
thinking
answer
it
your
through.
second question
I was
while
just
you're
thinking
here?
about, I was just thinking about those sites that perhaps infiltrated to pre-development levels already, and then they are doing a redevelopment of some kind. But I actually think that this doesn't really apply in this case.
Okay, and
I
then
think
just
that
for
they're
your
already
second question, we're asking if the MS4 towns that reference the stormwater handbook and their bylaws, if they will now be in compliance. When this goes through, the answer would be yes. But we do have public comment open till March. We're going to be going through them and then having this issued. So there is a bit of a delay. The EPA is aware that the stormwater handbook has been released. It's been coordinated with them. So I just can't promise that they're not going to, what their enforcement's going to be in the interim, because there is still that gap of time.
I just didn't know if I should be encouraging the towns I work with to go through a complete redo of their bylaws and go through annual town meeting, if by the time they get to town meeting and vote the new regulations in, the handbook would be updated anyway and would have been moved.
It's a great question, and I think something that needs to be coordinated with the EPA as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Courtney. I think we had a question sandwiched in between there from Melissa Kaplan. I'm going to ask, I think this is a Tom McGuire answer, but I think anyone of our team might be able to answer it. Wanted to confirm the addition of gravel and dirt roads as compacted. This means the use of these roads will require full compliance with the stormwater guidelines.
One, they're not guidelines, they're regulation. They've been regulations since 2008. Second thing is MassDEP hasn't defined gravel as impervious, but EPA has as part of the MS4 permit. So, I mean, we haven't proposed to change our definition of impervious to include gravel. But if you think we should change it to be consistent with the MS4 permit, that is, Liz pointed out, 74% of the communities in Massachusetts have to comply with. We'd welcome a comment on that.
Melissa, I don't know if that answers your question.
I think I was looking at it more of in terms of all of the miles of utilities that build gravel roads. But that's a comment I can submit later.
Right, okay. But if they're building those gravel roads within an MS4 permit area, that's considered impervious under the MS4 permit.
Right,
so
but under our proposal, Tom, under our proposal?
Our proposal has not proposed to change what's impervious. But if the town is within an MS4 and they're building a gravel road, they're going to have to comply with the MS4 permit.
I think in the regulation, there is a definition of impervious surface that includes compacted gravel, which then it's in the red line and then is defined later on. Well, compacted gravel is defined as well. So there is a definition in there showing how compacted it needs to be classified as impervious. This shouldn't be, hydrologically speaking, your gravel roads have always had a very high CN to begin with, so I don't think it's a significant change there, but please review and provide comments as needed.
Great, thanks, Liz. Next is a comment from Jane, and I'll just say so far seems much better. Jane, did you want to elaborate, or should we just take that at face value?
I think that was on the organization of the new handbook.
Oh, okay, thank you. I hope it is. Okay, Rich Clater. Hi, Rich. can you go back over the potential retention change from 1 inch to 0.8 in a little more detail? Dave, would you like to do that?
Yeah, you went pretty fast over that. You're, I guess, asking for more comments on that topic.
Yeah. Also, while he's coming on, there is a paper on the web about it, so you can read, a full description of like what we did and how we arrived at it. There is also a notice to reviewers on the web that kind of has a list of things that we're inviting, comment on in particular, but you can comment on anything related to these regulations.
And Rich,
Dave, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, really what it comes down to is that there was a 1 inch recharge target proposed back a couple of years ago. And then based on some advisory committee meetings, some folks thought that it'd be good to really do an evaluation of that. So DEP did a couple of evaluations. One is looking at a base flow separation analysis, and then one was doing a continuous rainfall simulation. And both of these analyses are posted on the web. So there's kind of a summary of the methods that were used for these and what the findings were. And both methods agreed that that a proposed recharge depth of 0.8 inches would still potentially maintain pre-development hydrology and base flow. So that's why
Okay.
Anything else that I can answer, Rich?
Yeah, I got that part. What I don't understand, that's why I didn't use the word recharge in my question. I used retention. The MS4 permit has a 1 inch retention target for water quality, and you're doing that kind of in your water quality unless you can't infiltrate that or recharge that. So I don't think this change matters too much in the recharge, which is why I wasn't commenting on it. But it's not going to change the water quality requirement. That's still going to be 1 inch for A, B, and C soils, unless you can't do it and then you go to the curves. I guess that's where I was coming from with my question.
Yeah, so for the water quality, that would really be based on just a percent removal. So you could use the EPA curves to meet the 90% TSS, 60% phosphorus. There are certain cases where there is a 1 inch water quality volume required. Like if it discharges to a critical area, and a couple other ones as well.
I thought the PA MS4 permit is a 1 inch standard everywhere.
Maybe we should let Liz address this. I think the curves drop that down dramatically, but they still have the 1 inch retention.
Yeah, that's where I'm confused.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how the MS4 permit reconciles those two different things.
Yep.
Liz, did you want to?
Sorry, I couldn't get my mouse over to unmute there for a second. Off the top of my head, I would have to look that up just to confirm. So you can look into that and get back to you, Rich.
Okay.
But Rich, maybe that's a good comment to make.
I'd like to get, that's definitely an important topic. So we'll try and add a comment and a question on that.
Good. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Yep.
We look forward to that. Okay, so
we are almost at time.
Yeah. Let's see. I think there's one from Joe, which was already previously mentioned about posting the volume 2, chapter 2, the appendix A red line, and if we have that available. Like Stephanie said earlier, it was very, it was impossible for us to develop a red line stormwater handbook, although we would have liked to have done that. If we have that for the appendix, we will certainly provide it. So we will take a look. Then Jane, when are we as we get more intense storms, shouldn't we be trying to infiltrate greater than 1 inch, not less? Dave or Tom? Since
Well, that's Jane, provide that to us in a written comment. I mean, as we get, sort of two things, there's the everyday storms, which is kind of what the 1 inch storm is based on. And then there's the extreme storms. So they're two different things, but yes, even the everyday storms, like instead of getting 40 inches of rain a year, let's say we're getting 45 inches of rain a year now. So as the everyday storms increase, then presumably the recharge is also increasing. So yeah, provide that to us as a comment.
Will
okay, guys. Go ahead, Jane. Did you want to?
Yeah, just yes, I'll put that in my comments.
Okay, thanks. From Annalise Boylan, for new redevelopment updates, was there consideration for existing impervious stormwater credit similar to stormwater Rhode Island stormwater regulations? Annalise, do you mean like for removing impervious surface?
Yes, there's stormwater credits in Rhode Island for redevelopments when there's a 50% existing impervious surface plus any new impervious surface that they have. So I didn't know if any of those similar regulations were considered when redefining what redevelopment would mean in Massachusetts.
I'm not sure whether I'm understanding that question. And whether I was going to say that, we do have credits, environmentally sensitive site design credits for like removing, I believe, for removing impervious surface. Does anyone want to take this one? I'm not familiar with the Rhode Island.
I'll defer to Dave on this because I didn't, in practice, this is something that DEP has done. We've given credit for removal for the, standard number 4, but I don't know if we added it to the credits.
Dave, do you?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, but I would say that there is a credit for redevelopment, and really what it comes down to is that it encourages using a minimum amount of impervious surface on the site, and then it kind of negates the need to meet the ESSD requirement. So, and I forget what the threshold is exactly, but it is it's credit number, I want to say 5. So it's but I'm not sure if we're answering the question. I feel like maybe the question was more about the definition of redevelopment.
I can review the credits more and then submit a formal question. So thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I just want to interject briefly because I have another meeting, so I have to drop off. So Lisa will probably reiterate this, but just to thank everybody, including you repeat attendees, so much for your time, both attending this and also for preparing comments. And just to reiterate that the purpose of these public information sessions has really been to hopefully at least give you a roadmap or, a crib sheet of sort of the highlights of what's in the proposed regs, the citations. So as you review them with your organization or agency or firm, whoever you're working with, that you'll have, a clearer context to help understand them. And that we very much look forward to your, official public comments on either the specific proposals in the draft regulations or any of the related topics that you guys have brought up today. All those comments are welcome. I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa because unfortunately I have to duck out.
Yes, Stephanie, thanks. There's only 2 questions left. We can, I guess we could, go through those and then we'll call it a day. If people, it's 3:05. So one of them is from Heidi Ritchie. It says those utility gravel roads are being expanded on a large scale. I agree this is as an important issue, but it is essential that we do not install a great deal of pipes and other hard infrastructure in these areas, as that would threaten amphibians and other small animals that get trapped in closed drainage systems. If stormwater management must be done for those gravel roads, please emphasize the use of open drainage swales. The forests, as Climate Solutions report calls out, utility corridors as important habitat. Let's make sure the stormwater regs align with that other state initiative. Okay, Heidi, thanks for that. That's a good comment. Can you make sure you put that in your written comments on the regulations? That's a thanks for that, Heidi. And then we have one from another Heidi, and it's not sure there's time, but can we hear a little bit more regarding the new roadway section? Heidi, do you want to clarify that? I'm not sure what you mean by the new roadway section. Heidi Davis?
Hi, sorry, I thought I heard that there was a new section on roadways. Perhaps I misheard.
Yeah, so there is, I think, I don't, Dave Roman, you can correct me. I don't think there's a section in the handbook itself, but there's the appendix, the highway considerations.
Yep, it's all in section 5.7 of the handbook. So, you know, it's called the state highway specific considerations.
Oh, okay. So yes, the highway specific considerations are, I think there's about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 8 considerations specific to state, roadways, specifically for DOT, but some of these considerations are applicable to other roadways that are funded by DOT. And, perhaps, DCR may be eligible for some of them. Some of them involve like specific specifications for like catch basin grates and I think drop inlets, right, Tom? And there's also like specific considerations for operation and maintenance, which is a very specific thing for MassDEP because they would have to make, their own commitments for what their O&M plan would look like. There's an off-site mitigation option for MassDEP that's related to their impaired waters program, mitigation program. Trying to think of what other. Does anyone remember what other considerations are? Anyway, there's about 6 or 7 or 8 special considerations specifically for roadways, and you can read about that.
Thank you for directing me to the section.
Yeah, in the draft handbook. Okay, so I think we're going to call it a wrap. And again, as Stephanie said, we thank you all for attending today. We appreciate all the questions. Hope it was helpful for you. We encourage you to submit written comments, to the appropriate location where, we had a slide up earlier. And thanks a lot. The public hearings are January 31st and February 1st if you want to provide oral comments, but that's not required. You can also submit written comments, or you can do both. Thanks very much for joining, everybody. Take care.